Hi, everyone. In this episode, we're going to ask the question, did the 12 find Paul was a false apostle? And this is going to be episode 3 in our series, What I Would Tell a Pauline Christian to Bring Them to Treat All of Jesus' Words are not only binding now, but also he is our sole teacher. However, we're also going to use this episode as a further example of chicanery of people who are defending Paul by using illegitimate means. Likely. And we're going to ask some assistance from those out there who might live near Stanford University to help us make this even more conclusive than it is already, but it is highly proven already, but we'll go on. So the question is there a chicanery to suppress Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, or now later after Erasmus raised doubts, they call him Ambrose iaster? Is there any chicanery to suppress Ambrose iaster's full statement about the 12 found Paul a false apostle? So is there some detail or material that's being omitted so we can't understand why they held him to be a false apostle? So now it's worthwhile to explain to both different audiences, the ones who are Pauline Christians, who someone has invited you to watch this series to help you understand the Jesus Words Only position. And we're also here talking to those who already have the JWO position and they want to know more evidence that they can use in their own personal evangelism to Pauline Christians, their family and friends who they're concerned about. So this is how this began for me to find this out. And so a book from 2007 I purchased not too long ago, and I scanned it, and here is only one paragraph. This is all there is, and it's called Ambrose iaster, and then it says the non-apostle, but actually when you read it, it's the false apostle. So they even put a title in that isn't describing it correctly. And let me just mention, Ambrose was the Bishop of Milan. The work that we're looking here was well recognized as written by Ambrose for centuries, millennia. And Erasmus, this means it went back to 360, 370 AD. And then 1200 years later, Erasmus says, I kind of wonder if this was written by Ambrose. And then that began this floodgates of people saying, hey, who else could have written it if it wasn't Ambrose? And so now you have 6 or 7 different options. And now it's called Ambrosiaster to mean it's someone like Ambrose, but not was him. And all I have to say to that is all of our gospels are basically not written by the person whose name is on it, meaning they physically didn't write. John didn't physically write his gospel. It's known that Papias was his amanuensis, meaning his transcriber. So he didn't write that, and his name isn't on the gospel. We've added the name Gospel of John. Do you know we added all those names? They don't come with the name. There's no Mark, there's no Matthew, there's no John, there's no Luke. Those are all names we've added. So by the same token, using this standard Erasmus did, we can cast doubt upon on all of those, and let's just all imagine who could it have been. And we don't know the amanuensis who wrote Matthew in Greek, because we don't know how Mark was able to write in Greek. These are people who spoke Aramaic or Hebrew, and yet they're writing in Greek. So obviously someone else intervened to help these texts become Greek from people who don't speak Greek naturally. They're living in a Latin-speaking territory of Rome, and it had not been under Greek control since 67 BC. So it's almost 90 to 100 years later. That whole memory of that period is forgotten. So so I'm going to sometimes just say this is the Bishop of Milan. And so his memory of what happened and why it happened is important. So basically discrediting it as written by Ambrose may have something to do with the passage we're reading here. So we're going to read it. Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continue to observe the law of Moses. This is commentary on 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continue to observe the law of Moses deny that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and the other apostles denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the sign of God's power in him. That's an extremely significant statement, unequivocal, as a matter of fact, no dispute in history. No one said, hey, where did Ambrose get this idea from? And you'll see the citation there, Ambrose the Iaster's commentary on 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. We're going to talk to you later about what are these source texts. Translated by Gerald Bray. Now, that's the key here. Gerald Bray is the key person who makes this translation. And he's going to do a book where he's going to now pull this translation originally that's going to be just a single paragraph in a bigger book, and he's going to then create a whole book with the entire First Corinthians in it, and he's going to have the same language again. So only one person has ever had this translation. It's Mr. Bray, and that translation has appeared here with Mr. Meeks's book by just doing an anthology, if you will. And then Mr. Bray has done 2 times books where he has the same thing, but no one else has ever corroborated or tested his statement. So we're going to do the testing that no one else has done yet. So let's go on. So here is the first book where he mentions it, and he's doing a running commentary on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and he's pulling in different people who give different quotes. So on 9:2, he'll find several people who give different quotes. So he's assembling sort of what we call an catena, a chain of commentary, running commentary from many people on many authoritative commentators on the same verse. So he's not trying to quote the entire context of the 1 Corinthians commentary by Ambrose the Iaster, but just pulling out this one quote. So it's the same thing I just read you. We'll just read it one more time so you hear it. 9:2, 1 Corinthians 9:2. An apostle to the Corinthians, Ambrose the Iaster. Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles, the 12, thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they, the 12, denied that he was an apostle. I'm adding that in so we get the they in significance. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the signs of God's power in him. Now, it's very clear when you read the full context of the commentary of Ambrose, or Ambrose the Iaster if you prefer, he is clearly pro-Paul, and he's saying this in a way of putting some bad news that people obviously knew about in the best light possible, which means the news must have been so well known that this was necessary to help assuage or downplay that news. But to us in the 21st century, we've never even heard that Paul was declared a false apostle by the 12. So this has got to be astonishing information to us. And and I just want to say this. You saw in our commentary on the Alexandrinist text being translated in such a way that there was a reference in there that that people wanted to suppress that Paul had died a natural death. He went to Spain and the limits of the empire, and then he went out of the world and departed to heaven, basically. So he didn't die a martyr's death. He died in Spain, and the person saying that was what? The Bishop of Rome. And so this whole myth that he had died in Rome in a martyrdom is refuted by the person who would know best if he even died in Rome, let alone was martyred. And he says he didn't die in Rome. He died on the outermost western part of the empire, which means Spain, where he always wanted to go. And he didn't die a martyr's death. So you see, that had to be suppressed. And that epistle was known as First Clement. And that was in the back end, the last pages of the Alexandrinist Bible that was handed in 1625 to King Charles of England. And it was a surprise, a shock. This part of canon, First Clement was always part of canon as far as anybody knew, all the way through 1100 AD. And where did it go? It just disappears. And the commentators, Mr. Hoole, in his book, we quoted you, he's like, this epistle has been erased everywhere. And it had to be systematic. And he tries to give you theories of why it would be. Well, this message here has been systematically destroyed wherever else it appeared. But this one passage was overlooked, in my opinion. Or they felt, he's excusing it. But now we're going to find out this is not the whole passage. So there's something being left out. So I'll come right back. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So the same gentleman, Mr. Bray, writes a book 9 years later. So this book here is the first one I showed you, first 1 and 2 Corinthians is written by or edited by Gerald Bray, 1999. And now he's going to write an entire book focused just on Ambrose the Iaster. That one little quote inspired him maybe to do the whole thing where he's going to now do the full commentary in 1 Corinthians. And he writes this in the year 2009. It's IVP, InterVarsity Press Academic. So we're talking about people who know their stuff. And this is the first, he says, well, let me just show you. This is how it's advertised. Corinthian correspondence are made available in English in English translation for the first time. That's basically what it's saying there. And I think that says it again here. And then 12 editions were published between 2009 and 2013 in English. So this is the first time a complete translation in English was ever made in 2009 of Ambrose or Ambrose iaster's work of the commentary of 1 Corinthians. Hard to believe with everything we publish all the time. And this is a very detailed verse by verse exposition. So it's very interesting that it was ignored until now. But Bray resurrects it, takes it out of the dust. So since 2009 to what? Today is 2023. So we're talking about 14 years. It's been out 14 years, and nobody has ever commented on this except me. Let's continue. All right. So here is now in this book. This is where he's going to do it again. Was he going to repeat what he did in his prior book, the book we showed you earlier, which was this book? Is he going to do it again? Yes, he's going to do the exact same thing with the exact same site. I'll read it one more time so you can see he's got it. He's got Mr. Meeks carrying the water for him, right? We read that. We then showed you what he said in his own first book, where it was just a snippet quote. And now we're going to show you what's in his book as his entire translation of all of this commentary of Ambrose or Ambrose iaster. He says, to read again, those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they, the other apostles, denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, because he was an apostle, because they had seen the signs of God's powers in him, they accepted him as an apostle. All right, and the site is still the same as he had in the prior one, and the one that Meeks had in his original re-quoting of this book. Now, what does CSEL stand for? It stands for Corpus Scriptorum Ecclesiasticorum Latinorum, Volume 81. Now, there's 3 parts in Volume 81, and there's only one part. That has, do you see this here? Because I'm going to ask anyone who's near Stanford University to go look at this page. It's volume 81, part 3, according to this, page 97. You see that? 3:97. That's apparently what it's saying. And I found it at Stanford University Library. The part 3 is right there, and it gives you the call letters. So if you can just go there, open up to page 98, take a picture of it on your cell phone is fine. Doesn't matter. Just some evidence that what it says, and make sure it covers all of this commentary on 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. All right. Now, just so you know, I checked. There is no online version of this now. And now I want to now show you, though, I found a Latin source for this, and a very reliable Latin source as it goes. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so now I'm going to read you the version that I found in a Latin text, and I'll show you what it is. It's called Patrologiae, Paris, 1879, by J.P. Mignet. He was the editor. He was a well-known editor. I want to just show you ahead of do a quick thing. There is a Wikipedia article, Patrologia Latina. We're going to get to that later. First, we're going to just show you what the evidence is, and then we can judge or assess that text. But he's apparently Protestant. So was the what was that? CELS, the Corpus Scriptorum Ecclesiasticorum Latinorum. If you look that up, it's sort of something associated with Austria, and it's got councils and so all this kind of stuff. But it's supposed to be international scholars collaborating on collecting Latin manuscripts and putting them all together. Even though we are past the Latin era, they're trying to collect them all, obviously with the ultimate intention that they would create translations from them. All right, so here's what it actually says in the Latin text that we the only Latin text we can find. Okay, so there is that other CELS I cannot find because it is not in any library online. Here's what it says. It first quotes 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. Although I am not an apostle to others, yet I am to you. And here's Ambrose the iaster's comments. Because by the Jews who believed and nevertheless kept the law, he was denied to be an apostle, for he was already teaching that the circumcised, meaning I think he means to say that the circumcision should not be observed, that circumcision should not be observed, nor should the Sabbath be kept, but to the rest of the apostles who, because of the scandal, concealed or hid themselves from this matter, he seemed to teach differently. Therefore, the apostle, meaning Paul, was denied by them. For to these, i.e. the Corinthians, he was an apostle, for from him they had seen him, Paul, do signs of virtue. And then it goes back to another quote of Paul. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord, says Paul, for by preaching this, they were converted from idols to the faith of the one God. So the two things that are new or different from the translation that are significant, there's minor changes too, that Mr. Bray had. He did not include the words because of the scandal, these apostles, the 12, hid themselves from this matter or concealed themselves. And that's important because that will tie into something that he says in Galatians 2, verse 11. The same person, Ambrose the iaster, is going to say that was a scandal, what happened in Galatians 2:11. You see, using the same terminology. So that appears to be what he's cross-referencing, maybe in his own brain, or expects the audience listening has it already in their own mind, that it must be something well known that there was a scandal between Peter and the 11 against Paul, and Paul against them. So, and Paul's shameless about it, by the way, in Galatians. And he tries to act like he's the superior one and the superiorly righteous person. And Peter is a hypocrite for withdrawing eating with Gentiles when James's representatives show up to see what's going on in Antioch, where Paul is eating, obviously, meat. And in that area, that region, every piece of meat is going to be sacrificed to idols because you can't buy meat in the marketplace in any of those kind of cities and those territories that haven't been sacrificed to the idols first, so that they would be blessed. So that's how, in fact, it was considered, like immoral to eat meat that didn't get blessed in that way. And so, but Paul said that's okay. You can eat meat sacrificed to idols. He said that in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 13. So that's the core reason there's a conflict. And Paul interpreted what Peter was doing was wrong, withdrawing from eating with them in that situation. And that, of course, would not be wrong. That was mandated in Acts 15. And Jesus in Revelation 2 says you can't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So there's a lot of two sides of this debate, but you can see Ambrose the iaster is seeing it only from Paul's side, and he's making them look shamed that this scandal was a scandal against Peter, not a scandal involving Paul. Paul should have the scandal on him because he's acting superior to someone who's in fact superior to him. He's the apostle who Jesus said, upon this rock I'm going to build my church. I mean, he's a foundation of the church. He's the leader, clearly, of the church without office, meaning he doesn't need to have a title to be a very influential and motivating person for people. He's involved principally in the early part of Acts before it switches to Paul. Again, that's because he's on trial, and this is a whole legal brief for his defense. Luke is putting together to Theophilus, who's a magistrate in Rome, who's advising Nero in an upcoming appeal. But that's a whole nother story. All right. So anyway, that's the differences. And I also found it interesting that the ending there is cut out by the commentator completely, Mr. Bray, where he talks about converted from idols to the faith of the one God. So this one God principle was much more obviously well spoken of in the early church. And again, this work is probably between 350 and 370 AD. So there's still a group of people who want to believe there's only one God. So there's still a remnant of the original faith, even people who were pro-Paul. All right. And I'm going to take another break. Okay, so I just want to show you the book to the left, Patrologia, where I got the Latin text. Again, it's an 1879 work. And he is a well-regarded, very highly well-regarded scholar in his own right. He did not attempt to make a, quote, critical analysis, which means critical analysis means I can basically say, I don't think the writer would have spoken like that. I can just toss it out. That's actually how far critical biblical analysis has got. They just simply said that he wouldn't talk like this, so I'm going to disregard this. Instead of using textual variants or some other historical basis for removing something. So this guy's saying, we're going to just print whatever is in the manuscripts, and that's it. Boom. And that's what we have today, or that's what we've had today. And we have to see what the CELS actually says now. It's trying to change things. And that book, or that volume, is from 1966. So between 1879 and 1966, maybe there was some manuscript that was discovered. Who knows? That maybe Ambrose iaster had another variant, and then they would have a justification. But right now, this man never cites any fact that there was even a variant in the passage we're looking at. He just tells us what he thinks it is and gives no citation to some sort of manuscripts that would support changing what had been the last known Latin version, which is in this book, Petrologiae. All right. So I want you to also see this is a side by side between the Latin on the right and which is translated by myself with the help of Google Translate, and then on the left is the English translation. Okay. And you can screenshot this. You can read this. Well, actually, I'm going to read just to show you how close Google gets. So I made sure every word was put in exactly as, every word was put exactly as it appears in Petrologia, and listen to how it came out. Although I am not an apostle to others, yet I am to you, because by the Jews who believed and nevertheless kept the law, he was denied to be an apostle. For he was already teaching that the circumcised should not be observed, nor should the Sabbath be kept. But to the rest of the apostles who, because of the scandal, concealed themselves from this matter, he seemed to teach differently. Therefore, the apostle was denied by them, meaning the title of apostle was denied by them. For the apostle was to these who had seen in him signs of virtue. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord, for by preaching this, they were converted from idols to the faith of the one God. Okay, so you can see how it just needs some smoothing out, and it's virtually comes out of Google Translate perfectly. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about Patrologia, so we provide some fair context that some people criticize it, and I want you to hear what that criticism is. Patrologia Latina is an enormous collection of the writings of the Church Fathers and other ecclesiastical writers published by Jacques-Paul Minier between 1841 and 1855, with indices published between 1862 and 1865. It is also known as the Latin series, as it formed one half of Minier's Patrologiae Cursus Completus, the other part being the Patrologiae Greco-Latina of patristic and medieval Greek works, with their sometimes non-matching medieval Latin translations. Although consisting of reprints of old editions, which often contain mistakes and do not comply with modern standards of scholarship, the series, due to its availability, it is present in many academic libraries, and the fact that it incorporates many texts of which no modern critical edition is available is still widely used by scholars of the Middle Ages, as in this respect comparable to the Monumenta Germanae Historica. Okay, so nobody's perfect. Apparently, he had typos or mistakes from time to time. Although in this text that I saw and I was working on, there was flawless and very well done. And the typography is difficult with Latin. You have special word letters. You know, the A and E have to be sometimes melted together, and all these things. You got it perfectly right. Did a great job. Easily translated to Google Translate. That shows you how excellent his typography, his organization, punctuation, everything was perfect. And so all I have to say is I'm more suspicious of someone who says, I'm going to use textual criticism, which is how I'll show you. Well, let me see. Is the CELS at their Wikipedia webpage, which explains them, they've used critical analysis, and I'm very much more suspicious about that when it's unexplained, when they just make the change and they don't tell you we've taken out words that used to be there for centuries, and we just felt it wasn't the way Ambrose would talk, or Ambrose iaster, who people don't even know who it is. So guessing how making a critical analysis about him means you really would have to be pinpointed who he is, and then you would maybe have some ability to judge whether he would or wouldn't have said something. All right, we're going to take another break. Okay, so I want to show you a theory I have, which is in Galatians, this same Ambrose will call this episode in Galatians 2:11 a scandal, but he means a scandal against Peter's actions, not Paul over Paul's own actions. So that just goes to show you have to see it from both ways. And here in this is fascinating because on this web page or website called eCatena, it's a lot like other eCatenas like earlychristianwritings.com, but it's actually much more comprehensive. So I'm very excited. It's just recently come up. Anyway, so here's what Paul says in Galatians 2:11. But when Peter came to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. All right. Now, when you go to the eCatena for 2:11, with this new eCatena that's out there, it's going to pop up here, and it says Clement of Rome around 99 AD writes the following. Now, I want you to know it should really have told you where it got this from, the Clementine Homilies. Now, the Clementine Homilies, as it was changed by Rufinus in about 390, he translates the whole thing from Greek to Latin, and then he throws away the original Clementine Homilies and obviously went to great lengths to destroy every copy he could find anywhere in the empire the way it used to exist in Greek. And apparently it was a popular book, so popular, I showed you the Mr. Hoole, when he's commenting on why did First Clement go out of circulation, he speculated because the popularity of the Clementine Homilies was existent at that time, and the church was trying to suppress the Clementine Homilies because of its positions about Paul implicitly, and so they were maybe trying to destroy one Clement because of this association of the name Clement with Clementine Homilies. That's what his speculation was. And I don't think that was true. Clementine Homilies were not that influential. And they'd all been rewritten, basically destroying their negativity towards Paul by changing Paul's name in 8 different places into Simon Magus, as all reputable scholars have indicated, is obviously how it originally read. It originally had Paul in there. And one of the times Paul is being addressed by Peter is the quote right here. See where it says Clement of Rome? So the person speaking is not Clement. Clement is quoting Peter. And I believe this was in the original text. And Peter's addressing Simon Magus, who this is one of the 8 times the scholars agree this is really Peter talking to Paul. So this gives you the other side of the coin. And the reason I bring this up is that's why if we had been told there was a scandal in 1 Corinthians 9:2, and then we could link it up to Galatians 2:11 by the same author, Ambrose iaster, using the same terminology as he did in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2, then we could then start piecing together what's going on here. Is this episode where Peter is rebuked and blamed by Paul, which is very offensive within any culture of an organization, particularly a religious one, where an inferior is trying to talk down to a superior. It's like it's outlandish behavior. You have to be respectful no matter what to someone who's a ruler over you. And incidentally, Paul, when he was in front of the Sanhedrin in his testimony in Acts, he insulted the high priest, and when he was told he's a ruler over you, he says, "Oh my gosh, I forgot. If I didn't," he said, "No, I didn't know it was a high priest. Otherwise, I know there's a law that you're not allowed to insult or curse a ruler over you." Well, what is he doing here? He doesn't have this right to rule. So the basic point is you cannot rebuke someone who's superior to you inside of an organization. You have to respectfully make your case, but not with no condemnation, with no claim that they should be blamed for anything. And also, Paul wasn't even in the right in this whole case, probably because he was the one advocating it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And Jesus is unequivocal in Revelation 2 twice. He says it's wrong in all cases, no exceptions. Anyway, let's listen to what is the other side of the coin. And so one day, if we can get a clear determination what was the reading in the CLS, we'll come back to this. But here's what is my belief of what's going on here there is a clear tie between what we read and this message here from Clement of Rome in this eCatena. So Peter's addressing Paul. Paul allegedly, though, in the corrupt Rufinus rewrite, It's still here, but it's addressing Simon Magus, but that's not it. It's Paul. And Peter says to Paul, if you were not opposed to me, you would not accuse me and revile the truth proclaimed by me, in order that I may not be believed when I state that I myself have heard with my own ears from the Lord, as if I were evidently a person that was condemned and in bad repute. So do you notice the same words right there, condemned? Well, that's the same words that is blamed here in Galatians 2:11. So it's a clear tie-in. Paul is being answered in the Clementine homilies as they are originally written. And here's the other big clue. When this commentary on Corinthians is written, it's in the 360 to 370 period. Rufinus has not yet destroyed the original Clementine homilies. So when this is written to the audience of Ambrose, his audience would immediately pick up on the fact that, or those who are can read, that the message is about the same episode. That's the scandal. The scandal is the church is still circulating. The original Ebionite church was still circulating that Clementine homilies up until the time Rufinus destroys it and turns it into a romance story and gets rid of Paul's name and puts in Simon Magus and makes it all about a lot of other frivolous things that are in there that don't have anything to do with anything. So that's my theory, that's what we're looking at, and I think there's strong evidence of that. So that's why those words were there. They were to refer to this, and that is why it gives you more confidence that indeed the 12 were addressing something that is actually an incident that's recorded by Paul from his perspective. But if you want to see the other side of the coin, you got to go listen to this quote. And there's more stuff. One of the other important remarks, and it take too long to go through the whole thing, but Peter tells Paul, so as far as Peter knew, that Paul had some sort of vision of Jesus, in the sky, but like not a physical one, but like to himself, like a vision that people sometimes claim when they're sleeping or dreaming or in a trance, they'll perceive they're having a vision. And he said to Paul, he said, "How can you preach what Jesus is teaching when all you've been trained is by a vision?" Whoa, what a blunt put down is that? So that's again in the Clementine homilies. So those are and there's a lot more, and it's really well written. I can't even do it justice by paraphrasing it. So we'll maybe go into that later, but you can see those who are people who are Pauline Christians, and you're trying to make a decision. Hey, should I turn back to Christ and just focus there, not follow Mr. Breaker claiming that we just pay attention to Paul? And we'll find out in heaven whether we're right or wrong, because we've done nothing on this earth to listen and follow Jesus, because Mr. Breaker says that's wrong. We're not to get our message there that way, and so on. Is that really going to get you to heaven? That, my friends, the answer is no, because you are missing the historical picture of what happened in the early church. And Breaker's being a fan of Paul is being a fan of someone who the 12 already rejected. And now we have a clear case of when it happened, why it happened, and it was in the lifetime of the apostles, and Paul was clearly on the outs with them. And that's that gives you another support, because don't you think if the 12 had decided this, that's key? People always tell me, oh, does Second Peter speak so nicely of Paul, so don't you think you have to follow what Peter says? Yes, I do. Generally, I think he's authoritative, but if he didn't see all the epistles of Paul and didn't have this interchange with Paul at the time yet, when he wrote Second Peter, well, it kind of moots the whole point. So we know later in time than Second Peter, Paul was rejected by the 12. So whatever happened earlier when Peter accepted Paul is outweighed by the fact that Peter later rejects Paul unequivocally in these passages, and it's admitted by a fan of Paul. So you cannot claim this is an enemy of Paul. This is a friend of Paul putting a nice spin on it to say, hey, it's really not a big deal that the 12 did this to Paul and just called him a false apostle and excluded him. Because you know what? The people in the pew, they make the decisions, not the apostles, of whether Paul's message is good or bad. And by the way, that is so contrary to the word of God. We don't make the decision. God makes the decision, and he gives us criteria to use to determine why someone is accepted or not into canon. All right. I hope that helps both audiences I was making this video for, those who are making a decision whether to follow Christ anew in a different way than you have been, being dispensationalist or whatever. And I hope you can see following Paul is not the way. and for those who are on this. Our mission is to help reach our family and friends who have been trapped by this false apostle. This is another piece of evidence that you can use to help persuade them. But we're going to also get to the bottom of whether there was a fraud in trying to remove and suppress these words, because you can see Mr. Bray has twice, actually, well, twice, he personally has translated it without the words I told you about, the scandal, and the apostles hid themselves. So there was clearly a break with Paul. They're not trying to socialize with him anymore, and they're made to look very foolish or evil or scared or ashamed of their own behavior. That's what Mr. Ambrose is trying to do, make them look like they're weaklings and in the wrong. So that I think can convince people that that's how bad Pauline Christians have written their commentaries to attack the 12 and lift Paul above the 12. So it's not just they lift Paul above Jesus, which is bad enough. They also lift Paul above the apostles themselves. All right, everybody. I hope that helped everybody. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.